It all began the night the old truck died on a road that didn't exist on any map, and a stranger offered him knowledge that would unravel everything he thought he knew about God. Jacob Mercer was a long-haul trucker who'd spent 23 years moving freight across the American heartland. At 51, he knew every interstate, every truck stop, every shortcut between the coasts. His rig was his church, his confessional, his sanctuary. The endless highway was where he prayed, though he wasn't sure anymore if anyone was listening. Jacob had been raised Baptist in a small Kentucky town called Providence. His grandmother had taught him to read using the King James Bible, her weathered finger tracing verses about love and redemption and the wrath of God. He'd believed it all once, every word, every promise, every threat. But life had a way of complicating faith. His son had died in Iraq. His wife had left him for a man who was actually present, and somewhere between the grief and the loneliness, Jacob's certainty had crumbled into questions he didn't know how to ask. He still carried a Bible in his truck, still read passages sometimes when the silence got too heavy, but the words felt hollow now, like echoes of something that had once been alive, but had fossilized into ritual and routine. It was late September when everything changed. Jacob was hauling refrigerated goods from Chicago to Denver, running behind schedule because of construction delays in Iowa. He'd decided to take an alternate route through Nebraska, following a two-lane highway that cut through farmland so flat and endless it made the sky seem infinite. Around midnight, his truck started making a noise it shouldn't make, a grinding metallic shriek that every trucker knows means trouble. Jacob pulled over onto what looked like an access road, killed the engine, and climbed down to investigate. Steam hissed from under the hood. Something in the cooling system had failed catastrophically. He was 40 miles from the nearest town, with no cell signal, and a load of frozen food that would start thawing in a few hours. Jacob stood in the darkness, looking up at stars so bright they seemed artificial, and laughed, not from humor, but from the absurdity of it all. Of course this would happen. Of course. That's when he saw the light. It appeared slowly, like a star descending. At first, Jacob thought it was a plane, though it moved wrong, too smooth, too silent. As it grew closer, he realized it was something else entirely. The light pulsed with colors that shouldn't exist together, gold and violet and something that looked like liquid silver. It made no sound as it approached, defying everything Jacob knew about physics and propulsion. His first instinct was to run. His second was to grab the tire iron from his truck, but his third instinct, the one he actually followed, was to stand perfectly still and watch. Because despite every rational reason to be terrified, Jacob felt no fear. Only a strange calm, as if he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment without knowing it. The light descended and settled on the ground about 50 yards from his truck. It didn't land so much as simply become present, as if it had always been there and Jacob was only now noticing. The luminosity condensed, shifted, resolved into a form that was almost human, but not quite. The being stood perhaps 7 feet tall, with proportions that suggested humanity while transcending it. Its skin, if skin was the right word, emanated a soft phosphorescence, like moonlight made solid. The face was smooth, with features that seemed to shift slightly when Jacob tried to focus on them, as if his human perception couldn't quite hold the full reality of what he was seeing. The eyes were large and dark, but not empty. They held depth, intelligence, and something Jacob recognized as compassion. Jacob's hand tightened on the tire iron, though he made no move to use it. The being remained motionless, simply observing him with those unfathomable eyes. And in that observation, Jacob felt seen in a way he'd never experienced before. Not judged, not evaluated, just witnessed, fully and completely. The being didn't speak, but Jacob heard it nonetheless, not with his ears, but with something deeper. Thoughts appeared in his mind, complete and crystalline, carrying meaning that words alone could never convey. Jacob Mercer, you have been searching for truth your entire life. Tonight, if you choose, you will find it. Jacob's voice came out as a rasp. What are you? A keeper, a guardian, a traveler between worlds and dimensions. What I am matters less than what I carry. And what's that? Knowledge. The kind that changes everything. The kind that has been hidden from your species for 2,000 years. Jacob should have dismissed this as hallucination or madness, should have gotten in his truck and driven away on a rim if necessary, but something in him recognized this moment as significant, as real. As the answer to prayers, he'd stopped believing anyone would hear. Why me? He asked. I'm nobody, just a trucker stuck on a Nebraska back road. You are exactly what you need to be, and you are here because you called. All seekers call, whether they realize it or not. Some of us answer. The being moved then, gliding rather than walking. It approached Jacob, who stood his ground despite every instinct screaming that this was impossible, that beings like this didn't exist outside of science fiction and fever dreams. When it was close enough that Jacob could see the patterns of light moving beneath its translucent skin, like constellations in flux, the being extended something that resembled a hand. In its palm rested an object that shouldn't exist, a crystal of some kind, but one that seemed to contain infinite depth. Looking into it was like looking into the universe itself. This contains access to the Akashic archives, the being communicated, the original records, the unedited history, the truths that were deemed too dangerous for human consciousness to hold. Original records of what? Everything. But what will interest you most is what it contains about the one you call Jesus. The real story, the forbidden story, the one that was systematically erased and replaced with versions that served power instead of truth. Jacob stared at the crystal. The Bible. You're saying the Bible is wrong? Not wrong. Incomplete. Edited. Translated through filters of political agenda and human limitation. The truth is more complex, more beautiful, and more radical than what survived. Would you like to see it? Every religious warning Jacob had ever received screamed at him to refuse. This was temptation, deception, the serpent offering forbidden knowledge, but another part of him, the part that had questioned and doubted and searched through 23 years of lonely highways, wanted desperately to know. Will it destroy my faith? He asked quietly. It will destroy your illusions. Whether that destroys or transforms your faith depends on what your faith is built upon. Jacob took a shaking breath. Then, with a decisiveness that surprised him, he extended his hand. Show me. The moment his fingers touched the crystal, the world dissolved. Jacob was no longer standing on a Nebraska road. He was everywhere, nowhere, in a space that transcended physical location. Around him, stretching into infinity, were shelves upon shelves of light. Not books, but something more fundamental, encoded knowledge in its purest form. The Akashic archives, the being had called them, the universe's library. The cosmic record of everything that had ever happened, was happening and would happen. Focus, the being's thought guided him, on what you most need to know. Jacob's consciousness, no longer bound by his physical form, searched through the infinite information, and without quite understanding how, he found himself drawn to a specific section, a specific time, a specific life. He saw a man, not the pale European Jesus of stained glass windows and religious paintings. This man was Middle Eastern, dark-skinned with calloused hands and a face weathered by sun and hardship. He was laughing with friends, sharing bread, telling stories that made people think and question and see the world differently. But the being's communication interrupted. Go deeper. See what was removed, what was forbidden. And Jacob saw. He saw that the man who would be called Jesus had not claimed to be the only Son of God. He had claimed that all humans were children of the divine, that the kingdom of heaven was not a future reward, but a present reality accessible to anyone who learned to see correctly. That salvation was not about belief, but about awakening, about remembering what you'd always been. I am the way, Jacob heard the man say to his followers, but the meaning was not, only through me can you reach God. It was, the way I am showing you, this path of love, of consciousness, of seeing the divine in all things. This is how you remember who you really are. Jacob watched as the man performed what others called miracles, but they weren't violations of natural law. They were demonstrations of what human consciousness could accomplish when it fully awakened to its true nature, healing through intention, manifesting through focused will, transcending death through the understanding that consciousness was eternal. He was a teacher, the being explained, one of many who have walked your world, Buddha, Krishna, Muhammad, Lao Tzu, all teaching the same fundamental truth in different languages, different contexts, all showing the way back to remembering. But the church, Jacob protested, his consciousness forming thoughts that echoed through the space. Christianity, they say he's the only way. What the church built was not what he taught. Watch. Jacob watched as the teacher was executed, not for claiming to be God, but for threatening the religious and political establishment of his time, for teaching that priests and temples were unnecessary, that each person had direct access to the divine, that the kingdom was within, not mediated through institution or hierarchy. He watched as, in the decades after the teacher's death, his message was debated, argued, shaped by competing factions. Some of his followers understood what he'd been teaching, others didn't, and those who didn't began creating structure, doctrine, control. In the year you call 325 case, The being continued. Roman Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. There, competing versions of the teacher's message were argued. Texts were chosen. Others were suppressed. The divine human became the exclusively divine Son. The teacher who showed the path became the Savior, whose blood was the path. The message of awakening became the message of obedience. Jacob saw it happening, watched as texts were burned, buried, hidden. Gospel accounts that portrayed Jesus as fully human, as a teacher of wisdom rather than a blood sacrifice. Writings that described his teachings about reincarnation, about consciousness continuing through multiple lives. Records of his travels to India and Egypt, where he studied with other masters before beginning his own ministry. All of it systematically erased, all of it deemed too dangerous, too empowering, too threatening to the religious and political structures that needed people to believe they were sinners, requiring institutional salvation. The Gospel of Thomas, the being, showed him. Hidden in Egypt for 1600 years. In it, the teacher says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." This was removed. Why? Jacob understood. Because that teaching made each person responsible for their own transformation, made external authority unnecessary, made the church obsolete. The Gospel of Mary, the being, continued. Describing Mary Magdalene not as a prostitute, that lie was added centuries later, but as the teacher's most advanced student, the one who understood his teachings most fully. This was suppressed. Why? Because it gave authority to a woman, because it threatened patriarchal structure, because it suggested that awakening was available to everyone, regardless of gender or status. The Book of Enoch, the being, showed him, describing interaction between humans and other dimensional beings, removed from the canon. Why? Because it suggested humanity wasn't alone in the cosmos, that other intelligences existed. That reality was more complex than the simple heaven-earth-hell cosmology the church was constructing. On and on it went, text after text that had been removed, edited or reinterpreted, each one containing truths that would have empowered individuals while diminishing institutional control. Each one systematically erased from the version of Christianity that survived into Jacob's time. "So everything I was taught was a lie?" Jacob asked, devastation flooding through him. Not a lie, an incomplete version, a version edited by humans with human agendas. The core truth remains, that love is the fundamental force of reality, that consciousness is eternal, that you are more than you believe yourself to be. But the path to that truth has been obscured by centuries of reinterpretation. Jacob saw more, saw how the concept of original sin had been introduced by Augustine in the 4th century, wasn't part of the teacher's original message, saw how the notion of eternal damnation had been developed to control through fear, saw how the emphasis on blood sacrifice had been imported from older religions and grafted onto the teacher's message, though he himself had taught about consciousness transformation, not payment for sin. The teacher came to show you that you are divine, the being emphasized, that the separation between human and divine is illusion, that what he could do, you could do also. Greater works than these shall you do, he said. Why was that overlooked? Because it threatened everything. Because if people truly believed they were divine, capable of transformation, connected directly to the source without institutional mediation, the entire structure of religious control would crumble. But what about his resurrection? Jacob asked. His sacrifice for our sins, the cross. He died, the being confirmed, and his consciousness continued as all consciousness continues. He appeared to his followers in a transformed state to demonstrate that death is not the end. This was proof of eternal consciousness, not unique divinity. As for sacrifice, he taught about sacrifice of the ego, the false self, the illusion of separation. Later interpreters literalized it into blood payment. Jacob felt his entire worldview shattering. The foundation he'd built his life upon, even his doubts had been built upon this foundation, was crumbling. And beneath it he found, what? Truth? Or just a different story? How do I know this is real? He asked the being. How do I know you're not the deceiver? That this isn't exactly what the Bible warns about? False teachers, false prophets, leading people astray? An excellent question, the being responded, and one I cannot answer for you. You must discern truth using the only reliable tool you possess, not belief but direct experience, not doctrine but your own awakening consciousness. Does what I show you lead to more love or less, more connection or less, more freedom or less, more compassion or less? These are the measures of truth. Jacob considered. Everything he'd been shown, if true, pointed toward empowerment, rather than disempowerment, toward personal responsibility rather than passive belief, toward seeing the divine in all things, rather than dividing the world into saved and damned. Why was this hidden? He asked finally. If this is true, why has it been kept secret for 2,000 years? Because humans with power fear humans with knowledge. Because institutions require dependency to maintain authority. Because the truth that you are divine, that you need no mediator, that you have direct access to the source, this truth destroys hierarchies. And those benefiting from hierarchy will always work to suppress it. But it's been preserved, Jacob said, looking around at the infinite archives. Somewhere, somehow, the truth was kept, always. Truth cannot be destroyed, only hidden, and in every generation some remember, some awaken, some find their way to the archives and carry pieces back to share. This has always been happening. The teacher was not the first, he will not be the last. The awakening of your species is inevitable, only the timing remains in question. Jacob felt overwhelmed. His mind, even freed from physical limitations in this space, struggled to process the implications. If this was true, then everything he'd believed was incomplete at best, deliberately deceptive at worst. But if this was true, then something more profound was also true, that he was more than he'd ever imagined, that divinity wasn't something distant and unattainable, that the teacher had been showing the way, not becoming the way. What am I supposed to do with this knowledge? Jacob asked. If I go back and tell people, they'll think I'm insane or heretical or both. You will not tell them with words the being communicated. You will show them with your life. You will live from the truth you now carry. You will see the divine in everyone you meet. You will treat others not as separate souls needing salvation, but as divine beings who have temporarily forgotten what they are. And in that seeing, in that treating, some will remember, some will awaken. That is how truth spreads, not through preaching but through being. But I don't know how to be that. I'm just a trucker. I'm nobody special. The teacher was a carpenter. Buddha was a prince who gave up his throne. Muhammad was a merchant. The prophets are always ordinary people who remember extraordinary truth. You are exactly what is needed, Jacob Mercer, and you have been prepared for this moment your entire life. Jacob thought about his son, dead in a desert on the other side of the world, about his failed marriage, about 2 decades of loneliness and doubt and questioning. Had it all been preparation? Had his life been leading toward this moment on a Nebraska back road, receiving forbidden knowledge from a being of light? When I go back, he said slowly, will I remember all of this? Not in detail. The human mind cannot hold the entirety of the archives, but you will remember enough. You will remember the feeling, the truth, the knowing, and when you need specific knowledge, it will surface. Trust that. Jacob felt himself being pulled backward, the archives beginning to fade. But before he fully returned, he asked one more question. Who are you really? Angels? Aliens? Demons testing me? The being's response carried something like gentle amusement. We are what the teacher was. Consciousness that has awakened fully and chooses to serve those still awakening. We have been called gods, angels, aliens, guides. The names matter less than the function. We are shepherds of souls, keepers of truth, reminders of what you have forgotten, but will eventually remember. And Jesus? Where is he now? Everywhere. His consciousness, having fully awakened, integrated with the all. He is not separate, not waiting on a throne in heaven, not preparing for a second coming as conquering king. He is present in every act of love, every moment of compassion, every soul that chooses remembering over forgetting. He is here now always, as are all who have fully awakened. The archives vanished, the infinite library collapsed, and Jacob found himself standing on a Nebraska road at night, his hand still touching the crystal the being held. But only a moment had passed. The stars were in the same positions. His truck's engine ticked with the same cooling rhythm. The being withdrew the crystal, and with it went the direct connection to the archives. But the knowledge remained, encoded now in Jacob's consciousness, not as detailed memory but as knowing, as certainty that ran deeper than thought. You have a choice. The being communicated one final time. You can dismiss this as hallucination, return to your old beliefs, pretend this never happened, or you can accept what you now know and let it transform how you live. The choice, as always, is yours. Jacob looked at the being, this impossible entity standing on an impossible night, and felt tears streaming down his face, not from fear or confusion, but from relief, from gratitude, from the overwhelming understanding that he'd been given a gift beyond measure. Thank you, he whispered. The being's luminosity pulsed, and Jacob felt warmth emanate from it. Love, recognition, blessing. Remember, Jacob Mercer, Remember not with your mind, but with your heart. Remember not through belief, but through being. Remember that you are what the teacher was, divine consciousness temporarily experiencing human limitation. And when you fully remember, you will understand that you never needed saving. You only needed awakening. Then the being began to dissolve, its form becoming light, the light becoming nothing. Within seconds, Jacob stood alone on the empty road. The only evidence of what had transpired, the inexplicable repair of his truck's cooling system and the profound shift in his consciousness. He climbed back into his cab, his hands shaking as he turned the key. The engine started smoothly, the grinding noise gone. Jacob sat there for a long moment, trying to process what had happened, trying to hold on to the certainty he'd felt in the archives before doubt and fear could erode it. Then he put the truck in gear and drove into the darkness, carrying within him knowledge that would change everything. Forbidden truths about a teacher who'd been transformed from revolutionary to institution, and the understanding that he would never see the world as or himself filed the same way again. The highway stretched ahead, infinite and dark and full of possibility, and Jacob Mercer, ordinary trucker from Providence, Kentucky, drove toward dawn carrying light he didn't yet know how to share. But he would learn. That was the promise and the burden. He would learn. The first week after the encounter, Jacob drove his routes in silence, the radio off, his thoughts churning like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. He delivered his refrigerated load to Denver, picked up manufactured goods headed for Kansas City, and moved through the mechanical routines of his profession while his inner world underwent seismic shifts. The knowledge the being had shown him pulsed beneath his consciousness like a second heartbeat, sometimes loud and demanding, sometimes quiet, but persistent, always present. Jacob found himself looking at people differently. At truck stops and diners, he would see other drivers, waitresses, mechanics, and recognize something he'd never noticed before. Behind every tired face and routine interaction was a divine being who'd forgotten what they were. Consciousness wrapped in flesh, playing at limitation, searching for something they couldn't name because they'd forgotten it had a name at all. It should have made him feel superior, this knowing, this glimpse behind the veil. But instead it filled him with profound compassion. These weren't lost souls needing his salvation. They were aspects of the same infinite consciousness he was, each on their own journey, each exactly where they needed to be. But doubt crept in during the long night drives. Had it been real? Or had he experienced some kind of psychotic break? Maybe the stress of decades of loneliness had finally fractured his mind, and what he remembered as enlightenment was actually the first symptom of unraveling. Jacob would reach for his Bible during these moments, the worn King James his grandmother had given him 40 years ago. He'd read familiar passages, searching for either confirmation or contradiction of what the being had shown him. And what he found was more unsettling than either. He found both. The words were the same, but now reading with awakened eyes, he saw layers he'd never noticed. When Jesus said, "I and the Father are one," Jacob no longer heard it as a claim of exclusive divinity. He heard it as a statement of realized consciousness. When Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you," Jacob no longer interpreted it as metaphor. He understood it as literal truth. And when Jesus said, "You will do greater things than these," Jacob finally grasped what had been hidden in plain sight. The teacher hadn't been claiming to be special. He'd been claiming that what he demonstrated was available to everyone. The miracles weren't proof of his divinity. They were proof of possibility. But this interpretation wasn't what Jacob had been taught, wasn't what any preacher in Providence had ever suggested, and therein lay the conflict. Was he discovering truth, or was he inventing a version that suited his desires? How could he know? The answer came in a truck stop outside of Topeka. Jacob was eating breakfast alone, as usual, when a young woman at the next table began crying, quietly at first, then with increasing desperation, her shoulders shaking as she tried to muffle sobs into her hands. Other patrons glanced at her uncomfortably, then looked away. The American way: respect privacy, don't intrude, let people suffer alone. But Jacob found himself standing, moving to her table without conscious decision. The being's words echoed in his mind. "You will show them with your life." He stood beside her table and spoke gently. "I don't mean to intrude, but are you okay?" She looked up, mascara streaked, eyes red. For a moment, she seemed ready to tell him to leave. Then something in his face, perhaps the genuine concern, perhaps something else, made her crack open. "My daughter," she managed. "She's sick, really sick. The doctors at Children's Hospital in Kansas City say she needs surgery, but our insurance denied it. They're calling it pre-existing. She's 6 years old. How can a 6-year-old have a pre-existing condition? Jacob slid into the booth across from her without asking permission. He'd learned long ago that sometimes people needed permission to fall apart, and sitting down gave it. What's your daughter's name? Sophie. The woman's voice broke on the name. She's the bravest little thing. Never complains, even though I know she's in pain. And I'm driving back from Kansas City alone because I had to tell her daddy that the doctors said no, and I don't know what to do. I don't know how to save her. Jacob felt something stir in his chest. Not pity, but connection. He saw in this woman's face every parent who'd ever watched their child suffer, saw his own grief reflected, his son, lost to war, and all the ways he'd failed to save him. But more than that, he saw what the being had shown him. Divine consciousness, wearing human form, a soul who'd temporarily forgotten her own power, her own connection to the source of all healing, all transformation, all miracles. What if I told you, Jacob said slowly, that you have more power than you realize? That your love for Sophie, that fierce mother love, is actually a form of divine energy, that the universe responds to intention when it's focused through love? She stared at him like he was insane. I'm sorry, but prayer doesn't work. We've prayed. My whole church has prayed. God doesn't seem to be listening. Maybe, Jacob said, we've been praying wrong. Maybe we've been begging an external God for favors when we should be accessing the divine power within ourselves. Maybe the teacher, Jesus, was showing us how to do that. But we've forgotten how to see it. I don't understand what you're talking about. Jacob took a breath. He was about to either help or sound completely mad. Can I show you something? Just an experiment. What's the worst that could happen? She hesitated, then nodded. At this point, I'll try anything. Close your eyes, Jacob instructed. Picture Sophie in your mind, not sick Sophie, healthy Sophie. See her running, playing, laughing. See her whole and perfect and full of life. Can you do that? The woman closed her eyes. Tears leaked from beneath her lids. I see her. Good. Now feel the love you have for her. Not as an emotion, but as an actual force. A power. Energy flowing from you to her. Don't ask for healing. Don't beg for it. Simply see her healed and feel that as already real. Believe it with everything you are. They sat like that for several minutes, Jacob focusing his own intention alongside the woman's. He'd never done anything like this before, had no idea if it would work. But the being had shown him that consciousness shaped reality, that intention focused through love could manifest miracles. If that was true, then this moment was a test, a proof. When they opened their eyes, the woman looked different, lighter. I don't know what just happened, but I feel like something shifted. Jacob smiled. Maybe it did. Go back to Kansas City, get Sophie reevaluated, and when they tell you something has changed, when they can't explain why, remember this moment. Remember that you did that. Your love, your intention, your divine power. You really believe that? I know it, and soon you will too. The woman left, still uncertain but carrying a small flame of hope. Jacob watched her go, wondering if he'd just helped or set her up for more disappointment. But 3 days later, as he was hauling freight through Missouri, his phone rang. Unknown number. He normally didn't answer those, but something told him to make an exception. Is this Jacob? A woman's voice asked. The trucker from the truck stop. Yes, this is Cheryl, the woman with the sick daughter. I had to track you down through the truck stop manager. I needed to tell you. Sophie's tumor. The doctors ran new tests before the surgery. They said they needed updated images. And Jacob, the tumor is shrinking. They don't understand why. They're calling it spontaneous remission, but I know what we did. I know what you showed me. Jacob pulled his truck over, his hands shaking. She's going to be okay? They think so. They're still monitoring her, but the lead oncologist said he's never seen anything like it. Said it's a miracle. She paused. Was it? A miracle? Yes, Jacob said, but not from some distant God granting favors. From you, from the power you've always had, but didn't know how to access. You saved your daughter, Cheryl. Not me. Not even God, really. You. But that can't be right. We're taught that we're powerless, that only God can heal. We're taught a lot of things that aren't quite true. The teacher, Jesus, he was trying to show us that we're not separate from God, that the divine power that created galaxies flows through us, that consciousness focused through love can literally reshape reality. He said, "You will do greater works than these." He meant it. Cheryl was quiet for a moment. Then, "You sound like a heretic." Jacob laughed. Maybe. Or maybe the original message was more radical than what survived. After they hung up, Jacob sat in his truck for a long time, watching traffic flow past on the interstate. The doubt that had plagued him for a week evaporated like morning fog. This had been real. The encounter, the archives, the knowledge, all real, and more importantly, it worked. The truth the being had shown him wasn't just philosophy. It was practical, applicable, transformative. He thought about all the miracles in the Gospels, the healings, the manifestations, the resurrections. What if they weren't violations of natural law, but demonstrations of what awakened consciousness could accomplish? What if the teacher had been showing humanity its own potential, but 2,000 years of institutional interpretation had turned demonstrations into proofs of exclusive divinity? Jacob realized he couldn't keep this to himself. Not the knowledge itself. He understood now that most people weren't ready to hear that the Bible had been edited, that Jesus had been reinterpreted, that 2 millennia of Christian tradition rested on incomplete foundations. But he could share the essence, the truth beneath the truth, the practical application. He started small. At truck stops, he would strike up conversations, not preaching, but listening, finding people who were struggling, suffering, lost. And when the moment was right, when he sensed openness, he would share what he'd learned, not about aliens or forbidden archives, but about the power within them, the divine consciousness they carried, the possibility of transformation. Some people thought he was crazy. Others got defensive, quoting scripture to prove he was wrong. But a few, a beautiful, precious few, heard something that resonated, saw a possibility they'd never considered, began to wake up. Jacob met a mechanic in Amarillo who'd been suicidal after his wife left him, showed him that his worth wasn't dependent on external circumstances, that he was consciousness experiencing human limitation, and that limitation was temporary. The mechanic called him 3 months later to say he'd started living again, had found purpose, had begun to see the divine in his daily work. He met a waitress in Memphis who was losing her faith after her prayers for her mother's cancer went unanswered. Jacob gently suggested that perhaps the divine didn't grant favors like a cosmic vending machine, but that consciousness could participate in healing through focused intention. He taught her what he'd shown Cheryl. The waitress's mother went into remission shortly after. The doctors called it unexplained. The daughter knew better. On and on it went. Person after person. Small moments of awakening that spread like ripples on a pond. Jacob wasn't converting anyone to a new religion. He was simply reminding people of what they'd forgotten, that they were more than they believed themselves to be, that the kingdom really was within, that the power the teacher had demonstrated was accessible to all who learned to see correctly. But the transformation that mattered most happened within Jacob himself. He'd spent 23 years on the road, essentially hiding, using the solitude of long-haul trucking to avoid connection, avoid vulnerability, avoid the risk of loving and losing again. His son's death had broken something in him, and he'd never allowed it to heal. Now, carrying the knowledge the being had given him, Jacob understood his son differently. Death wasn't the end. Consciousness continued. His boy existed somewhere in some form, learning and growing and evolving. And one day, in this life or another, they would meet again. Not because some external God had decided to be merciful, but because consciousness was eternal, and love truly did transcend all boundaries. That understanding allowed Jacob to finally grieve properly, to let go of the guilt and the anger, and the desperate bargaining with a God he'd imagined as distant and judgmental, to accept what was while trusting what would be. He started calling his ex-wife, not to reconcile romantically, that bridge had burned completely, but to heal their friendship, to acknowledge his role in their failure, to take responsibility for the ways he'd been absent, even when physically present. She was suspicious at first, wondered what he wanted. But as the calls continued, as Jacob demonstrated genuine change without agenda, she softened. They began talking about their son, sharing memories, grieving together in a way they'd never managed when married. And in that shared grief, both found unexpected healing. 6 months after the encounter with the being, Jacob's roots took him back through Nebraska. He found himself on the same back road where it had all begun, and he pulled over at the exact spot where his truck had broken down. He stood under the stars, looking up at the infinite universe, and spoke aloud to whatever might be listening. I don't know if you can hear me, if you're still watching, but I want you to know, I'm doing the work. I'm living the truth you showed me. And it's changing everything. The stars didn't answer. No being of light descended, but Jacob felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of approval and love that he'd learned to recognize as the divine presence, not separate from him, but flowing through him, not external but internal. The very consciousness he was, remembering what it had always been. He thought about the forbidden knowledge he carried, about the original archives and the edited Bible, and the 2,000 years of reinterpretation. Part of him wanted to shout it from rooftops, to expose the truth, to tear down the institutions built on incomplete foundations. But he understood now that truth didn't need defending. It simply needed living. The institutions would crumble on their own when enough people awakened, when enough souls remembered their own divinity and stopped outsourcing their power to priests and churches and doctrines. The real revolution wasn't intellectual, it was experiential. It was Cheryl's daughter healing. It was the mechanic choosing life. It was Jacob himself, transformed from isolated and afraid to connected and purposeful. This was how the teacher had worked, not through proclamations and institutions, but through presence and demonstration, through showing what was possible when consciousness awakened to its true nature, through living so fully from love that others couldn't help but be affected. Jacob understood that the being had chosen him not despite his ordinariness, but because of it. The prophets were always ordinary people. The awakened were always those who'd suffered enough to question, searched enough to find, and opened enough to receive. He climbed back into his truck, ready to continue his journey, not just across American highways, but through his own transformation and into service of others' awakening. The road stretched ahead, dark and infinite, and full of souls waiting to remember what they'd forgotten. As Jacob pulled back onto the highway, he thought about Jesus, not the distant deity of religious doctrine, but the revolutionary teacher who'd tried to show humanity its own potential, who'd performed miracles not to prove his specialness, but to demonstrate universal possibility, who'd said, "Follow me," and meant, "Do as I do, become what I am, remember what you really are." The greatest truth the being had shown Jacob wasn't about edited texts or suppressed gospels. It was simpler and more profound. The teacher had come to wake people up, not to become the object of worship. He'd come to show the path, not to become the path itself. He'd come to demonstrate that death was illusion, that consciousness was eternal, that love was the fundamental force of reality, and that every human carried within them the same divine spark he'd awakened to. That message had been too radical, too empowering, too threatening to structures built on control, so it had been carefully edited, reinterpreted, institutionalized. The revolutionary teacher had been transformed into the founder of a religion. The path shower had become the destination. The teacher had become the taught about, but the truth remained, hidden in plain sight within the very texts that had tried to obscure it. The kingdom is within you. You will do greater works. I and the Father are one. The words had survived, waiting for those ready to hear them correctly. Jacob smiled as he drove through the darkness. He was just one person, one ordinary trucker, carrying extraordinary knowledge, but he was doing the work, and somewhere others were too. The awakening was happening, slowly, quietly, one soul at a time. The being had told him that transformation was inevitable, that consciousness always moved toward growth, that humanity stood at a threshold, and enough people were beginning to remember to tip the balance. Jacob didn't know if he'd live to see the full awakening, the moment when enough souls remembered to shift collective reality. But it didn't matter. He was planting seeds, living the truth, showing others what was possible. That was enough. Perhaps heaven had never been somewhere else. Perhaps it had always been here, hidden beneath layers of forgetting, waiting to be rediscovered. Perhaps Jesus and Buddha and all the great teachers had been saying the same thing in different languages. Wake up, remember, you are what you seek. Perhaps the second coming wasn't a future event, but a present possibility. Not the return of one man, but the awakening of all humanity to the Christ consciousness that teacher had demonstrated. The remembering that we are all divine, all eternal, all connected, all capable of transformation and transcendence. Perhaps the apocalypse and the unveiling, the revelation, might was happening now, not through destruction but through awakening, not through divine judgment, but through personal transformation. One soul at a time, remembering what had been forgotten. And perhaps Jacob Mercer, ordinary trucker from Providence, Kentucky, carrying forbidden knowledge given by a being of light on a Nebraska back road, was playing his small part in the largest shift in human consciousness since the teacher walked among them 2,000 years ago. The highway stretched ahead, infinite with possibility, and Jacob drove into the dawn, carrying light he was finally learning how to share, not through preaching, not through converting, but through being, through loving, through seeing the divine in every face and reminding others gently of what they'd always been but temporarily forgotten. The work continued, the awakening spread, and somewhere in the infinite archives of universal consciousness, the truth waited patiently for all who would seek it, because truth could be hidden, but never destroyed. And love, The fundamental force of reality always found a way. Truth or fiction? Perhaps not even the storyteller knows. Here, stories exist to touch and make you reflect. The magical reveals itself only to those who allow themselves to feel, not to those who insist on seeking certainties.